The Franklin Cultural Center in Columbus, Georgia, glittered under the weight of its own elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across round tables draped in white linen, each adorned with centerpieces of roses and lilies that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Wine glasses clinked, their delicate stems catching the light, while a string quartet played something refined yet forgettable in the corner. The room buzzed with polite laughter, the kind that filled spaces where people wore their wealth like a second skin. Silver name pins gleamed on tailored jackets and silk dresses, not because anyone needed reminding of who was who, but because it was a ritual, a subtle flex of status in a room full of people who thrived on being known. Harold Benton moved through this world like a shadow. At 67, he had mastered the art of being unseen. His hands, steady and calloused from years of carrying trays, collected half-empty champagne flutes from table 9 with a precision that bordered on elegance. He wore the standard caterer's uniform, black tuxedo, white gloves, polished shoes that pinched his toes but never betrayed discomfort. His gray hair was neatly combed, his face calm, unreadable. Harold didn't mind the invisibility, not really. He'd spent over 3 decades learning how to blend into the background, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to let the world's assumptions slide off him like water. Some people only noticed you when they wanted something, or when they wanted to make you feel small. Either way, he'd learned to let it go. Tonight, though, something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an undercurrent he couldn't quite name. The Gala was a charity event, one of those evenings where the city's elite gathered to raise money for a museum expansion while sipping overpriced wine and trading stories about their latest vacations. Harold had worked hundreds of these events, each one blurring into the next. But tonight, as he reached for a glass near table 9, a voice cut through the hum of the room like a blade. "You know," Camilla Wexler said, her voice loud enough to carry, "I bet you know how to play, don't you?" She tilted her head toward the baby grand piano tucked in the corner near the bar, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier's glow. "Why don't you give us a little something, set the mood?" The words landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling outward. A few chuckles floated from nearby tables, mostly from people who laughed without knowing why, their eyes darting between Camilla and Harold. Camilla, perched at the center of the room like a bird made of diamonds, gave him one of those smiles that wasn't really a smile, more a performance, polished and practiced. Her blonde hair was swept into an updo, her dress a shimmering emerald green that caught every light. At 52, she was a fixture in Columbus society, a woman whose wealth came from old textile money and whose influence came from knowing exactly how to wield it. Harold didn't flinch. He met her eyes, steady and calm, his face betraying nothing. The clinking of cutlery softened. A few guests turned in their chairs, curious. Someone near the stage lowered a microphone stand, then paused, as if sensing a shift in the room's rhythm. Harold set his tray of glasses gently onto a nearby table, the movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the piano. The silence that followed stretched like a long hallway. No one moved, not Camilla, not the mayor, not the man who had just bitten into a scallop skewer. It was the kind of silence that asked questions before the answers arrived. Harold pulled out the piano bench, dusted it off with one hand, and sat down. For a moment, he didn't touch the keys. His fingers hovered above them, as if reaching for something long buried. Then, softly, he began. The first notes were quiet, almost too quiet to catch under the faint whir of the air conditioning, but they carried weight, each one landing like a stone dropped into water. It wasn't cocktail party jazz or some jaunty tune to match the room's mood. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune, slow and aching, fragile as if each note had to fight to be heard. The melody unfolded like a memory, delicate yet undeniable, filling the ballroom with something no one had expected: truth. People stopped mid-bite. A woman in the back lowered her phone, her thumb frozen over the screen. A server halfway across the room stood still, tray balanced on one hand. Even Camilla sat up straighter, her wine glass forgotten in the air. Harold's hands moved with a grace that belied his years, each note drawn from a place deeper than the room could hold. He didn't look down at the keys. He didn't need to. The music flowed from somewhere older, somewhere that had survived decades of silence. By the time he reached the middle section, where the melody folds into itself like a quiet breath, the room was no longer a ballroom. It was a cathedral, reverent and still. No one laughed, no one spoke. The event photographer, a young man named Tyson Cho, slowly lowered his camera, his lens no longer chasing candid shots of smiling donors. Camilla's smirk had slipped, replaced by something unreadable, guilt, perhaps, or awe. Harold didn't look at her, didn't look at any of them. He was somewhere else, maybe back in a cramped Baltimore apartment with peeling paint and a second-hand upright, or on a stage long forgotten, before life had rewritten his story. As the final notes lingered, the room held its breath. Then came the release, applause, but not the kind that follows a performance. It was hesitant, reverent, almost guilty, as if the crowd wasn't sure they deserved to clap. Some stood, their hands moving slowly, like they were waking from a dream. Camilla didn't clap at first. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes fixed on Harold, who still hadn't looked up. For the first time that night, she wasn't the center of the room, and no one, not her, not the guests, not the mayor, had the faintest idea who Harold Benton really was, or what had been stolen from him long ago. Harold's story began in Baltimore, in a row house with thin walls and a mother who sang gospel hymns while folding laundry. His father was a quiet man, a shipyard worker who believed discipline came before dreams, but his mother saw something else in Harold. "You got something in your hands, baby," she'd whisper, pressing his small fingers between hers. "Don't ever let them tell you different." By 11, Harold could hear a song once and play it back by ear. By 13, he was writing his own pieces, stitching together fragments of sound from the radio, from street musicians, from the hum of the city itself. His middle school music teacher, Mrs. Cheney, saw it right away. She dragged a recording engineer from a local college to hear Harold play, helped him apply to Juilliard's pre-college program, and stood with his mother outside their row house the day the acceptance letter arrived. Juilliard changed him, not because of the prestige, but because of the other students who carried themselves with a confidence Harold had never known. He had talent, raw and undeniable, but they had certainty, a kind of armor he hadn't yet forged. Still, he practiced harder than anyone, 8 hours a day, blisters soaking in ice buckets, no parties, no distractions. His dream was too precise to allow for anything else. At 23, he graduated top of his class. He was invited to play at Carnegie Hall for a young composer's showcase. Wearing a navy suit his cousin mailed him from Philly, 2 sizes too big. He played like someone who had been waiting his whole life for that moment, and afterward the audience stood. Harold didn't hear the applause. He heard the silence that followed the last note, a silence he understood better than any ovation. His name began to appear in small magazines, college forums, whispers among those who predicted he'd be someone. But then the call came. His sister, Rosalie, had collapsed during her shift at a diner. By the time Harold reached Baltimore, the doctors had a name for it: leukemia, aggressive and unrelenting. Their mother had died 2 years earlier, and Rosalie had a son, Marcus, barely 5 years old. There was no one else, so Harold went back. He tried to keep music alive at first, teaching private lessons, playing small recitals. But hospital bills have a way of erasing dreams. He took a job with a catering company, just for a while, he told himself. One night became 1 week, 1 month became a year. By the time Rosalie passed, Harold had sold his piano. He never went back to New York. He raised Marcus like his own, put him through college, paid rent on time, kept things quiet. Life didn't offer a second spotlight, and Harold stopped asking for one, but he never forgot the music. Late at night, he'd tap his fingers against the kitchen counter, trying to recall a piece he'd written during a snowstorm in New York. The melody was gone, but the feeling remained. For 33 years, he stayed with the same catering company, moving through rooms filled with high society types, politicians, developers, socialites, old money, new money, tech millionaires who thought they'd invented class. They called him Sir when sober, hey, you, when drunk. Harold smiled either way. Sometimes during event setup, when the room was empty, he'd sit at whatever piano had been rolled into place. Always alone, always just for a few minutes, he'd run his fingers over the keys, testing them like old bones. He never played a full song, just enough to feel something stir in his chest. No one ever caught him, or if they did, they didn't care. Once, in Birmingham, he worked an event where the speaker was a conductor who'd rejected him for a summer program decades ago. The man didn't recognize Harold, just waved off the wine list and asked if the risotto was dairy-free. Harold smiled, nodded, and kept moving. That's how it always went. He'd crossed paths with others from his past, musicians, agents, professors. Some were still in the spotlight, most forgotten, just like him. None looked closely enough to see the man offering napkins had once shared their stage. Harold wondered if they even remembered his name. It wasn't bitterness, it was reality. You learn to live with being overlooked when the world makes it clear it doesn't expect much from you anymore. But that night, when Camilla Wexler pointed to the piano and laughed, something cracked open. Not because she was cruel. Her comment wasn't even the worst he'd heard, but because it was so familiar. It reminded him of every time someone had assumed he had nothing to offer but service, every time he'd been treated like furniture with a name tag. He wasn't angry, he was awake. That's what made him walk to the piano, not to prove anything to her or the guests, but because for the first time in years, someone had handed him an invitation, even if it was meant as a joke, and he took it. Camilla Wexler wasn't used to being challenged. At 52, she was a woman who navigated life with the ease of someone born into privilege. Her wealth came from an old textile family in Savannah, the kind whose names were carved into the sides of historic buildings and country clubs. Her father had told her once, "It's not just about having money, sweetheart. It's about being seen giving it away." That line had shaped her more than she cared to admit. To most in the ballroom, Camilla was charming, stylish, well-connected, a little sharp, perhaps, but generous. She wore custom heels, favored vintage brooches, and corrected people's grammar with a laugh soft enough to seem harmless. She wasn't cruel, not deliberately, but she existed in a world where assumptions were currency. If you carried a tray, you were help. If you wore gloves, you weren't meant to be heard. If you were older, working a service job, you had probably missed your moment, if you'd ever had one. So when she made the comment about the piano, she didn't think twice. It was a throwaway line, a way to get a laugh, to remind the table she was still the center of it. She had no idea the man she'd turned into a punchline had once stood on stages she could only dream of entering. At first, she thought he might be playing along. Maybe he could tinker out a tune, and they'd all have a cute moment to giggle about. She reached for her wine glass, smiling at the others, but when Harold started to play, really play, something inside her stopped. The notes weren't casual, not the kind you picked up from YouTube tutorials or a keyboard in your living room. They were practiced, disciplined, full of feeling. She didn't recognize the piece right away, but she knew it wasn't for her. He wasn't performing, he was remembering. The room went still, and Camilla felt the shift like a physical weight. She looked around, saw the guests frozen, their forks hovering, their phones lowered. She saw the server with the tray, the photographer lowering his camera. And she saw Harold, his hands moving with a grace she hadn't expected. His face calm but distant, as if he were playing for someone who wasn't there. That scared her. Not the music, but what it revealed. She'd spent her life in rooms like this, full of polite people and polished cutlery, where she held the microphone, the clipboard, the final say. But now, all eyes were on the man she'd tried to turn into a joke. Her stomach tightened. She hated the feeling. Not guilt exactly, but exposure. People were filming. She could see the phones, the whispers, the glances. If they found out what she'd said, how she'd said it, it wouldn't look good. The story would stick. The woman who made fun of the waiter, who assumed he had nothing to offer but a tray. She sipped her wine, trying to play it cool, but there was no recovering. When the last note faded and the applause began, not polite but reverent, she stayed seated. Clapping didn't feel like hers to give. Across the room, Tyson Cho, the photographer, was no longer snapping party shots. He'd caught the whole thing, from Harold's first note to the stunned faces of the crowd. This wasn't just another gala moment. It was something that might matter. Near the buffet table, Tasha Brenner, a local journalist covering the event for an arts blog, scrambled to open her notes app. She was supposed to write about who wore what, how much money the gala raised, but this was a different story. She typed quickly, "Waiter plays Clair de Lune, crowd stunned, Camilla Wexler joke, emotional reaction, must dig into background." Harold's co-workers were speechless. Glenn, a younger server, leaned over and whispered, "Man, what the hell was that?" Another muttered, "That was real." Like real. Harold didn't respond. He was back to work, clearing plates, straightening chairs, pouring water like nothing had happened. His face was calm, but inside, something had shifted. Not pride, not triumph, just release. It had been so long since he'd let that part of himself breathe, the part that had once existed before life turned sharp. He hadn't played Clair de Lune in years, not since Marcus was a teenager and convinced him to try again at a community center. He hadn't made it past the first page then, but tonight something had opened. Maybe it was Camilla's laugh, sharp and assuming. Maybe it was the way everyone looked through him all evening, like he was wallpaper. Maybe it was just time. The videos hit social media before Harold clocked out. A guest named Adrian Lott, a real estate agent from Macon, posted a 45-second clip to her Instagram story. The waiter just played Debussy like it was Carnegie Hall. Dead serious, whole room frozen. Another guest uploaded a longer version to TikTok. This man was collecting glasses 10 minutes ago, then this happened. The footage was raw, shaky, but it captured the moment. Harold at the piano, framed by stunned faces, a woman gasping softly at the final note. Within an hour, the clips were being shared, stitched, debated. People argued in the comments about who he was, whether it was staged. Others didn't care. They just wanted his name. Harold rode the bus home, same as always. His shift ended at 11:15. He changed in the staff bathroom, folded his tux jacket into a neat square, and nodded at the night security guard. His phone was an old flip model, no apps, no internet. He didn't know what was happening online. At home, he poured coffee, fried an egg, and sat in his small kitchen, the same routine as always. The piano was still in the ballroom, untouched. He didn't know that by morning his name would be everywhere, not in a headline, grabbing way, but in that quieter space where stories hit a nerve. Tasha Brenner wasn't satisfied with her notes. She wanted facts. 2 emails, 1 phone call, and a scanned recital program from 1981 later. She had her headline, Juilliard pianist turned waiter stuns Gala with unannounced performance. By noon, local outlets picked it up. Harold Benton, 67, of Columbus, Georgia, had been a rising star from Baltimore's classical music scene. Accepted into Juilliard at 17. They mentioned Carnegie Hall, the composition award he'd won his final year, even found an old black and white headshot from a Lincoln Center flyer. What they didn't mention, what Harold never forgot, was how quickly it had all slipped away. It wasn't just Rosalie's illness, though that had been the tipping point. It was the slow series of closed doors in New York. He'd been invited to perform but not offered teaching posts. He was respected on stage but invisible at receptions. Audiences applauded, then forgot him. When he tried to book a solo tour, the agent suggested he write for others instead. "You've got real talent," the man said, "but the concert scene's tight. Might be better to work behind the curtain." Harold had smiled, thanked him, and never called again. He remembered a music director who, after an audition, said that was beautiful, unexpected, as if beauty from his hands was something strange. He learned to stop trying, to stay in the shadows, not because he lacked ability, but because the world made it clear it didn't expect him to be more than what it saw. Camilla's joke hurt because it was familiar, a reminder that no matter what he'd achieved, he was still someone you could dismiss without consequence. But the piano didn't care about assumptions, and for once, neither did Harold. The next afternoon, Harold returned to work as if nothing had happened. He pressed his shirt, packed a turkey sandwich into a plastic container, and took the same bus, sitting near the window. The Franklin Cultural Center was hosting a luncheon for an education nonprofit, and Harold was assigned to beverages and table resets. But the mood was different. Co-workers who usually nodded in passing stared, whispered. A prep cook paused mid-slice, blinked at Harold, and muttered, "That was you, huh?" Harold gave a small smile. "I suppose it was." Tyson Cho, the photographer, was back in the ballroom, waving Harold over. "Mr. Benton, do you go by Mr. Benton?" he asked, excitement barely contained. "That was the most incredible thing I've witnessed at one of these events, and I shoot 6, 7 a week. The clip I posted, 500,000 views overnight. People are asking about you. Do you want to talk about it on camera? I could shoot something clean, maybe a short piece." Harold interrupted gently. "I appreciate that, but I'm not looking for all that." He moved on, carrying water glasses to the setup table. Devon Morales, a director from the Gala, approached him next. "Harold, we need to talk. Camilla Wexler called me this morning. She's concerned about how things looked. The video, her comment, she says it was taken out of context, but it doesn't look great." She wants to apologize personally. Harold raised an eyebrow. She's here. She's parking, Devon said, lowering her voice. You don't have to talk to her if you don't want. Harold nodded, not out of agreement but understanding. When Camilla arrived, she wasn't wearing diamonds or vintage brooches. She wore a gray sweater, minimal makeup, her face tired. Mr. Benton, she began, her voice cracking. I owe you an apology. I was wrong to speak to you the way I did. I thought I was being playful, but it was dismissive and unfair. I didn't know your background, your talent, your history, but that's not an excuse. Harold met her gaze. You didn't have to know my history. You just had to treat me like a person. Camilla swallowed hard. You're right. I'm sorry. A few onlookers pretended not to listen. Harold didn't care. I'm not angry, he said, but I'm tired of being looked through. Camilla extended her hand. Harold shook it, firm and brief. She walked away, her step less certain. By sunrise, Harold's name was everywhere, not in a celebrity scandal way, but in that quieter space where stories resonate. On Facebook, strangers shared videos with captions like, "Reminds me of my grandfather," or "Never underestimate anyone." Harold's flip phone couldn't access the internet. He didn't know what TikTok was. He liked the calm of mornings, 2 eggs, black coffee, gospel on the radio. But his voicemail blinked non-stop. Radio hosts, bloggers, even NPR. Marcus read the messages to him, laughing. "They're calling you the piano man." Harold shook his head. "I played one song." "You played one song," Marcus said, "but it meant something." Tasha Brenner's blog post exploded, not viral in a fame-chasing way, but in the way stories spread when they hit a nerve. She got emails from former Juilliard students who remembered Harold, a retired professor who wrote, "He had magic in his hands. I told a colleague he'd either change the world or vanish from it." The Franklin Cultural Center posted a photo of Harold at the piano, captioned, "A reminder that talent has no expiration date." Juilliard retweeted a clip, "Some gifts never fade." People called the catering company, asking for the pianist. Some wanted to book him for private events, one for a church service. A local college music professor invited him to speak to students about resilience. Harold listened as Marcus read the offer. "I haven't spoken in front of a crowd in over 30 years," he said. "Maybe it's time," Marcus replied. Harold didn't say yes or no. He just washed his dish, letting the water run over his fingers. That night, Marcus showed him the clip on a borrowed tablet. Harold watched himself play, saw the room's stillness, Camilla's expression shifting, people frozen. He leaned back and exhaled. "It's strange," he said, "to see yourself like that, as if you've been waiting to be remembered." Marcus didn't push. "I think they want more from you." Harold smiled. "I'm not sure I have more to give." "I think you do," Marcus said. "I think you always have." 3 days later, Camilla showed up at Harold's door wearing jeans and a navy coat. "I don't mean to intrude," she said. "You already apologized," Harold replied, leaning against the doorframe. "That was in a hallway with people watching," she said. "This is just me. No press, no agenda." He stepped aside. They sat in his small living room, a worn couch, a scratched coffee table, photos of Rosalie and Marcus. "You have a beautiful home," Camilla said. "I built a quiet life," Harold replied. "Doesn't get noticed much, but it works." She nodded. "I've been thinking about what that moment looked like through your eyes. You weren't just playing music. You were telling us something, and I didn't listen until it was too late." Harold exhaled. "I wasn't trying to send a message. I was just tired of being small. You gave me an opening, even if it wasn't kind." Camilla swallowed. "I'd like to learn from it, not for show," But for real, I've spent years pretending I was the most cultured person in the room, but what you did, that was depth. You weren't shallow, Harold said. You were unchallenged. She looked surprised by his grace. If you want to do something with what you learned, he added, do it without waiting for applause. He led her to a back room where an old upright piano sat near the window. Got this one second-hand? He said, rebuilt it myself bit by bit. He gestured to the bench. You want to know who I am? Sit and listen. Camilla sat. Harold played a quiet tune he'd written long ago, uneven but raw, like memory being stitched together. When he finished, neither spoke. Camilla stood, eyes wet but clear. Thank you for reminding me that some things still have the power to change people. Harold gave a small nod. She left quietly, and he stayed, hands resting on the keys like old friends. 2 weeks later, the community center on Reynolds Avenue filled with people for piano night with Harold Benton. No fanfare, just a paper flyer, 6 p.m., free admission. Harold wore his Sunday jacket, a burgundy handkerchief from Rosalie tucked in the pocket. Marcus helped with seats, grinning. Co-workers, college students, neighbors, and parents with kids came. Camilla sat in the third row, no makeup, no cameras, just a listener among many. The piano was an old upright, slightly out of tune but full of character. Harold began with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, slow and thoughtful. Then he played one of his own pieces, warm and winding, like walking through memory. The room held still. Kids fidgeted. An older man closed his eyes. When he finished, the applause was gentle, the kind that fills the space between people when something meaningful passes through. A little girl asked, "Did you really play in New York?" "Yes, ma'am." Harold smiled. "Do you know any songs with dragons?" "Not yet," he said, "but maybe I'll write one." A music teacher approached. "Would you consider coming to the school, just to talk, maybe show the students a few things?" Harold paused. He'd thought that part of his life was over. "Let's talk later," he said. As the chairs were stacked, Camilla approached. "That second piece was yours, wasn't it?" He nodded. "I've never heard anything like it," she said. "You weren't supposed to, not back then." "I'm glad I did now," she replied and left quietly. The next day, no cameras showed up, but something had changed. The community center called. New baby grand had been donated in Harold's name. No plaque, just a gesture. He began holding Saturday sessions, not lessons, but open afternoons for anyone who wanted to learn or listen. Children came with curiosity, teenagers with questions, adults with regret. Harold welcomed them all. He hadn't become famous. He'd become seen, and sometimes that's the greatest recognition a person can ask for. Not headlines, but the quiet knowledge that their story matters, that it still matters.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.